I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce our next speaker, Andrew Critch, or Critch for short. He's a researcher at UC Berkeley's Center for Human Compatible AI and founder and president of the Berkeley Existential Risk Initiative. Today, Critch is going to describe recent improvements to the simulation process, or SProcess for short, an algorithm that enables multiple funders to simultaneously delegate the optimization of funding decisions to overlapping groups of trusted advisors. Take it away, Critch.
Thank you. Okay, so last time I spoke at a Funding the Commons event, I spoke about the SProcess, which is a simulation process. I'll talk about that a little bit for background in this talk. But there's more about it here, and this is the link to the previous presentation. But as the schedule title says, I'm going to talk about some improvements to that process that we call speculation grants that I'm pretty excited about. And I was actually somewhat inspired by the past Funding the Commons event to get a move on starting. So thank you for that inspiration. The slogan for what we're doing with the Survival and Flourishing Fund, in my opinion, is pushing the frontier of collective intelligence, fairness, and trust. And I'm going to kind of quickly shoot through some of the past background stuff. So if you want to grab things before I breeze past them, just prepare your screenshot hotkey, whatever it is. I think it's Command-Shift-3 on most Macs, or 4, and then Alt print screen on Windows. So apologies, I might click through faster than your eyes, but maybe not faster than your clicks. Some background. First of all, I just want to draw everyone's attention to the concept of deliberative polling. Here it is. It's just a really important equilibrium mechanism for bringing people closer together and finding the truth when they vote on things. And I invite everyone to check out the Center for Deliberative Polling at Stanford, or other writings on deliberative polling as an important process. You hear Quan talking about, in Athens, the theater being used to disseminate important information. We need that in order for collective decision-making to work well. So the SProcess is a grant-making and grant evaluation procedure that we use, involving a certain amount of simulation, but also a certain amount of discussion in a meeting series for deciding where grants go. And I'm a big fan of it, obviously, because I helped design it with Oliver and Jan, also, who you met in a previous talk today. But it has a shortcoming, which is that this collective reasoning procedure is slow. It takes time for people to respond to each other and update on each other's opinions. So I wanted some way to insert some fast money in between those slow conversations. And we're now doing an experiment that we're calling speculation grants that I think is just going to keep happening. It seems, so far, in my opinion, the experiment's going great. And it's the main thing I'm going to try to introduce in this talk that I haven't spoken about publicly before. So a little bit of background on the SProcess. It's a process that mostly Jan, but some other philanthropists, including Jed McHale and David Marble, have funded to make over 25 million in grants now, over 5 grant-making rounds, varying sizes since 2019. And I think we'll distribute another 5 to 10 million in our current round, hosted at the Survival and Flourishing Fund website. If anyone's interested, please invite people to apply. We now have a rolling application procedure. So there's just a single application that can be used to apply for grants at any time, and then we evaluate them as soon as we announce another round. And the basic building block of the problem that the SProcess solves is trade-offs between marginal value functions. You have organizations that have differing abilities to scale. Some could be ready to absorb $10 million effectively. Some might only have space to make good use of 100K, but maybe it's a really exciting use case, such that you have these marginal values trading off against each other. And you have a little bit of a coordination problem with other donors in terms of when to stop funding an organization that's already full of money. So the SProcess also aims to solve that. But just starting with the case of just one funder, there's already a useful thing you can do, which is that you can decide where to make money or where to give money by making these marginal value functions explicit. And we have an app that enables that. If you explicitly represent the marginal utility or marginal value of giving to different organizations, you can solve an optimization problem, and that'll tell you how much money you should give to each one. It computes the trade-offs for you. So if you've ever thought, gosh, when do I stop, or when should the world stop giving here or there? The answer is like, represent some marginal value functions, do trade-offs. There are exceptions when the marginal value functions are non-monotonic, but when you take into account the uncertainty of what other funders give, it very often averages out the non-monotonicity and smooths it out in a way where you have monotonic values anyway. So I think it's a pretty versatile way of deciding trade-offs. So that's the basic building block of the SProcess. We have all of our evaluators represent their values in this kind of form. And this has a lot of advantages that I'm going to maybe skip over expounding on because I have another whole other talk talking about it. But in short, I will say that when we aggregate opinions from people about how to spend money, we should not be aggregating scalars. We should be aggregating marginal value functions. The incentives for sharing are better. The game theoretic incentives for sort of trying to play chicken with each other about who funds what are much reduced. They're not eliminated, they're just significantly reduced. Mutual legibility is improved, so there's actually more information exchange than if you just bid scalars at each other. So anyway, everyone should share marginal value functions and not scalar numbers for how much organizations should get. And if you do that, then you can easily compose together lots more people with marginal value functions over organizations or even over intermediaries who are evaluating organizations for them. So what our app actually does is it enables one or more funders to write marginal value functions for deferring to one or more grant recommenders who they themselves write marginal value functions for recommending grants to organizations that have applied for funding. So let's see if I have ready a nice view of what funders can do. So this is the overall view of where the money flows after all the funders. But if you just look at one funder here, these curves represent how much the funder wants to recommend money through each of these different initialed people. These are just fake initials. The data is anonymized, but these are real numbers that came from real grant evaluations, but we just changed the names of the organizations and twiddled the numbers a little bit to anonymize. But you can see here, as the discussion is unfolding, the funders can change their opinions of the different evaluators, how much money should flow through each of them. And again, I'm not asking funders to represent their opinion of a recommender or evaluator using a single number. I'm asking for a marginal value function because that is what you need to do trade-offs. And so once the funders draw those curves, they flow through the actual recommenders here and down to the bottom layer of organizations, which are not depicted. And you can see here how much the organizations are getting. And if you take this recommender here, say BO, someone's name is BO, right? If we stop funding BO, funding for Whisper goes down a bit, but not so much. Where if you fund BO a lot, Whisper goes up. So there's a kind of robustness here because of the marginal value functions. BO wants to fund Whisper, but if we completely eliminate BO from the funding game by giving them basically no value, other people, I'm sorry to say it's the opposite, but other people are going to pick up the slack of what BO doesn't fund to some degree if their marginal value functions capture that. So now going back to how this all combines together, we have this multi-layered optimization problem that we can solve pretty straightforwardly. And the cool thing is this whole thing is stackable. Not only is the sharing of marginal value functions stackable, but the discussions are stackable. We can have discussions between the recommenders recorded, and which we do, and then the funders listen to those recommendations and can have a certain amount of discussion amongst themselves about, okay, I actually think recommender 2 here is making a lot of good points. Maybe we should crank up the marginal value functions on that person and channel more funding through their judgment. So overall, we've got recommenders each drawing their own batch of marginal value curves. As you can see, there's quite a lot of diversity between people in terms of the shapes that they want to draw and how they want to represent their views. And I think that's just a representation of like the true reality of how people differ in their opinions. And then the funders can tune their values and get final recommendations that flow through simulation and tell you, okay, how much is being granted. Now, the cool thing is that, throughout discussion, people can tune their numbers and update on each other and make points that other people are going to use to change their minds and update their numbers. So this isn't like a sealed ballot operation by any means. It's very much a discussion We don't aim to be to isolate the information, but rather to be more like the Athens Commons, where people share information and deliberate together in reaching not necessarily a perfect equilibrium, but a steadier state than you would if you didn't have any discussion. So I think there's a lot of interesting things to say about this mechanism. For example, quadratic funding, as a lot of people here, I imagine, have heard, is a great funding mechanism, but it results in suboptimal allocations because funders fail to coordinate on overfunding or underfunding problems. There's a lot of honesty properties that you see coming out of the SProcess that are sort of complementary to the honesty processes or the honesty incentives in quadratic funding. So you can combine these, and it's a fun research problem to figure out the optimal structure for doing that if anyone ever wants to collaborate on it. There's lots of research in game theory showing that mutual transparency is good and engenders cooperation. It's important to aggregate beliefs, not just values, and beliefs aggregate according to different rules than values. So you don't want to mash all your beliefs and values together all the time. You want an opportunity for discourse to combine beliefs and values separately. And lastly, there's interesting things to think about in the space of how much a given mechanism, such as the SProcess, incentivizes dishonesty. Usually people think in the past, a lot of game theory research looked at whether a mechanism engenders perfect honesty or elicits perfect honesty or not. But the fact is there are scalar degrees of incentive to lie in a given mechanism that combine with external forces and internal moral impulses, to be honest. So we need to think about the scalar degrees of honesty that we elicit. In any case, the SProcess takeaways that I want as a backdrop for the things I'll say about speculation grants are that, number one, we should aggregate not numbers. We should not aggregate single number evaluations of orgs or how much money they should get. We should aggregate marginal value functions for the value of giving and when to stop. Funders, it's a lot easier to bring funders into a mechanism if they have final say over it. So it's not like they give you all their money and then you hand it out. It's more like they give you a budget and you produce a recommendation. It's much healthier. And discourse, can't recommend enough. I just want to plug improvethenews.org. I have no affiliation with this group. I just think it's great. I think everyone should think about how to use sliders to make the sharing of information more transparent and legible to each other. Okay, so because it's collective, it's slow. This process involves people coming together, arguing, debating, recording debates, funders listen to it. So we only do it twice a year. What happens if someone just needs 100K right now to capture a really attractive hire and grab them away from an exorbitant for-profit offer? There's a need for something faster. So that's what speculation grants are for. And I want to give a shout out to Owen and the whole team here at Funding the Commons for helping just inspire this idea. I was toying with it for years. Lots of people think about retroactive funding mechanisms, and just the energy here was excited enough about the idea, and Jan wanted to do it too. So we just finally got our act together and made a retroactive funding mechanism for speeding up the SProcess, and I'll explain how that works. But I also want to give a shout out to Owen's presentation here. If anyone wants to screenshot, maybe you can type in a long string and or just look at previous Funding the Commons talks. So how speculation grants work is this. You've got some foundation. You can imagine the Survival and Flourishing Fund as something like a foundation. It's a group process that's slow, and it involves some philanthropists deferring to a team of people that help them think and decide and evaluate things. And normally the foundation, just makes grants by some slow process, and maybe the grants are relatively large to the fast money that we're going to try and move here. And the way speculation grants happen is that first the philanthropist or maybe the foundation gives a budget to someone that they delegate to call a speculator. So with that budget, maybe it's 200K is our standard budget for speculators now. The speculator can make grants to charities that apply and provide enough information to execute that grant through a donor-advised fund, which is a structure for holding money in a charity that is readily disseminated to existing other charities. So the speculator can just say yes to an incoming request and fill in the details, and now the money goes out. So it's really fast. It's not consensus driven, but it is consensus evaluated. So I like having this slow deliberative process as a check on what happens later. Much like a board of directors can review the decisions of a CEO after the fact, and that creates an incentive for the person being evaluated to sort of be reasonable according to a diverse set of perspectives. So once that speculation grant is made, that's what we call it, it's speculating, because there's a certain amount of speculation about whether the group is going to like that grant later. Optionally, especially if there's this slow process is evaluating the charity at the same time, when the speculator makes, say, a 50K grant, we also note down what I'll call a grant deduction, like a tax deduction that says, hey, we've already given 50K. So if this normal process comes out and says you should give $1 million, well, we've given 200K already, and that's not accounted for because these processes were simultaneous. So now we're only going to give 800K more. So that's an optional step to make things run smoothly in parallel. And then at the same time, assuming that that this request for a grant was formatted in a way that's ready to be evaluated by this larger group, which we require. We require that formatting. They require the request to be evaluatable by this larger group. Then later, when this larger group can evaluate the same charity for a grant and evaluate the speculator's decision to have made that grant at the same time. Those two evaluations naturally batch together. And so we get a way of then saying, hey, great job, you made a 50K grant. We think that was, like, you doing that was worth 70K of our usual grant dollars. And now, again, we're using the numeracy of these evaluators to relativize the value of dollars, and it's entirely subjective. But by combining the views of more people, you converge a little bit more on something that at least this like filter bubble of people will think is reasonable. And then we have this fun step here where the settlement can be rejected. And there's also an earlier step about delaying when the grant will be evaluated that I'll talk about a little bit later. But basically, there's some aspects of this are already kind of implicitly in effect when you have people like program officers at foundations who undergo periodic evaluations to remunerate their budget, or a CEO, like I mentioned, is evaluated regularly by boards of directors who can then choose to change their remit or replace them even. So what we're doing differently, and what makes us call this a speculation grant, is that we really want to treat the grant kind of like an asset that the grantor can wield and choose to sort of sell back or trade back to the evaluation org. So I'm going to step back a slide and just describe that. So let's say you make a 50K grant to the Alpha Institute. So let's say Bob the speculator makes a 50K grant to the Alpha Institute, and he thinks about it and he's like, I'm a physicist. The Alpha Institute is a physics thing, and I understand it. And I think it's going to take a while for these people to really get how good the Alpha Institute is. So I don't want them to evaluate my grant for like 2 years until the products are out and you can really easily see the value in what I've just funded. So you can say, I don't want this grant to be evaluated until 2024, kind of like choosing the date on a futures contract. And similarly, if later the foundation comes back and says, yeah, your 50K grant was, we think it was worth like 30K of our normal dollars. So here you go. That's your remuneration. So your budget kind of shrank. Maybe you had 200K to start. You made a 50K grant. Now we've remunerated you with a 30K adjustment. Bob the speculator can say, you know what? I reject that offer. I think if I give it another 2 years, you're going to reflect on this and realize that this was an amazing grant that I did, and these people did amazing work, and we all deserve a lot of credit for recognizing it. So I say no to your 30K, and I want to wait another 2 years, and I think by then you're going to think I made a better decision. And that has a kind of market-like property. It's like Bob the speculator is selling the rights to having made the impact of making that grant. He's kind of selling it to Alice the philanthropist here. And it's not selling any personal assets. These are all just trades in a budget for doing good within an existing pool of charitable dollars. So no one is having to pay taxes on these dollars. They're already earmarked for charity, and they can't be they can't be returned to the philanthropist. So we have software hooks for preventing conflicts of interest and so on. The result of that little bit of extra autonomy is that the speculator is much more like an independent agent than like maybe even a CEO or a program officer could be. And so they get to choose how much when they make their grants, how much are they making grants to like build cred and get remunerated for more money in their budget versus how much are they cashing in the budget they already have to grant to things that they think are good that they expect the foundation to never really appreciate or remunerate. And I consider that a feature, not a bug as well. It creates a diversity in what we give to, which I think is important. And a lot of interactions implicitly involve a trade-off between building cred with an institution and then cashing in that cred for favors or promotions or whatever. And with the speculation grants, it's just explicitly built in. And it dovetails really nicely with the SProcess, because when we evaluate grants for the SProcess, we implicitly evaluate the marginal value of the first 50K, the next 50K, the next 50K to giving to an organization. And so since Bob's speculation grant of 50K was the first 50K to reach them, you've already got a formula for the relative value of Bob's speculation grant compared to the other giving opportunities. So at least for speculation grants that happen concurrently with the SProcess round that evaluates them, that is to say, if Bob doesn't delay the evaluation, there's a ready-made formula that we use to evaluate their relative value, which I think is going to work great. Thanks to you guys for this event and the inspiring talks about the future. And I love the solar punk meme. I wanted to say thanks to Oliver and Jan for collaborating on this. Could never have done it without either of you guys. The funders, obviously, Barry, the nonprofit, for piloting the SProcess early on, Owen and Paul for inspiration on the impact certificates front. So yeah, thanks.